Hello everyone, my name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ and like to welcome you to today's user share. We are going to be hearing part 2 of the Windows 10 on XenDesktop series, and we're happy to have Mr. James Rankin back with us by popular demand. Just quickly go over our housekeeping details. We have a presentation a presentation today with Q&A. And we'd like you to type your questions into the question area of the GoToWebinar control panel. Our moderator will keep an eye on those questions and we'll ask them as they come up, and we'll get those answered for you. Also, I wanted to let you know that this presentation is being recorded and will be posted on mycugc.org afterwards, and you will also receive a link to that recording in an email. Moderating for us today is Andrew Wood. Andrew is a CTP. He is a member of the UK CUGC Steering Committee. And I'll let Andrew come on and say a little bit about himself and introduce our presenter.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm in sunny London. I think James is in slightly cloudy and overcast South Shields. Hopefully you're having a good evening, and we'll take some good information from this next hour of fascinating content that I've seen before, actually. It is my pleasure to host the UK Citrix user group along with Neil Spellings, Jim Moyle and some others, and James is a regular contributor to those sessions. He's come along with a good series talking about Windows 10, specifically in a XenDesktop environment, based on his understanding expectations and his testing and his delivery for organizations, both large and small. James follows this up with some videos. There's some excellent content of him showing off what it is that he's learning and understanding in his videos, and on his blog at htguk.com/blog. And what we've got today is an hour of his time to talk through the stuff that he knows about on Windows 10 FTA. Yes, that's right. You can follow James on AppSense because he hasn't got the Avanti remarketing branding done yet, but I'll let James now take it away. James, if you could entertain us, please.
I would indeed. Are you going to make me presenter over there, or?
Yep, I'll send it to you right now.
Thank you very much. Okie doke. Let me just get the slideshow actually started. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, as Andrew said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is part 2 of a bit of a small series about Windows 10 on XenDesktop. We did the first part, talked mainly about the big changes that you'll see in Windows 10 with regard to how it's serviced and how it's updated and how upgrades come down and how you would enable that migration. And those are kind of the biggest sort of changes from an IT admin perspective that you're actually going to see out there when you adopt Windows 10. However, in the migrations and the deployments of Windows 10 that I've done, one of two of the really biggest bugbears that we had were the new Microsoft Universal Windows Apps platform, and rather bizarrely, file type associations, which were kind of a thing that really we solved, really, I think, almost back in the days of Windows 7, and it was very unusual to find so many calls post-migration to the help desk with one of the migrations did, specifically talking about problems with file type associations, and that mainly the problems from that tie in with the Universal Apps platform, as we will see. So hopefully there should be some interesting and relevant stuff for you in here, some possible pitfalls to avoid around the new modern apps platform and file type association to help you out if you choose to deploy Windows 10 via XenDesktop. So just a quick bit of flagrant self-promotion about myself. I am based in Sunderland in the UK. I have now given myself the grandiose job title of Technical Evangelist at a company called Howell Technology Group. I've been blogging since 2012 and I've been writing tech articles since about 2013 for a variety of different websites and publications, and as mentioned before, my handle is still @SenseBigot on Twitter, which used to be the name of my website. So if you might want to follow me on Twitter, you can join such esteemed people as well-known adult movie star Jenna Jameson, in fact, who is one of my followers rather bizarrely out there. She must like technical content, clearly.
Every single time. Every single
Hey,
time.
hey! You know, that's my biggest claim to fame. I've been trying to actually get Jenna Jameson to tag a tweet with the Citrix user group in it, but she hasn't gone for it yet. I can only assume she must get thousands of direct messages from people all across the world. Some of them possibly
Some of them less technical than yours.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Or technical, but in a very different way.
Yes. Plenty of diagrams, things. Anyway, I'm digressing horribly.
Let's move on.
Yes, right. So, quickly, just an introduction about the UWP platform and FTA handling. It's actually not specifically a Windows 10 sort of thing, really. It came along in Windows 8. And that's where we first had all of these universal Windows apps, which at the time were called Metro apps, and they were called that, and they were then kiboshed by some trademark lawyers from possibly the Paris underground system or something like that, and it was then called Notro, or the interface not formerly known as Metro. But anyway, all of these changes came along in Windows 8. But having said that, Windows 8 and 8.1 possibly wasn't that widely adopted. Server 2012 R2 on the XenApp published, seeing quite a bit of that. But really, a lot of people have almost kind of bypassed Windows 8 from a VDI perspective, and they're waiting for Windows 10. But that's where it all actually came along in the first instance. Now, one of the migrations that I did to Windows 10 during and after the Windows 10 migration, specifically to do with Universal Windows Platform apps and file type associations, we had 16% of support calls from that time. It doesn't seem a huge lot when placed in a diagram like this, but it was, I think, the second biggest complaint that we had in a specific category was about file type associations, and that tied directly in with the Universal Windows Platform. The biggest complaint, incidentally, was the speed of the first logon, which is actually related to the Universal Windows Platform as well. So it is all quite nice and relevant. So anyway, let's just talk about a bit of background about the Universal Windows Platform sort of apps that we have out there now, because I think that's what Microsoft have finally sort of settled on as the name. They're called Universal Apps rather than Modern Apps or any of the other names that they seem to have had out there. So the main key drivers that we have up here are basically security. They run in app containers, which are intended to prove isolated on a whole number of levels. It's supposed to provide a unified application experience. So if you've got a desktop, laptop, your phone, if you're one of the few Windows Phone users, or if you've got an Xbox console, or you even use a HoloLens, it's intended to give you this whole, the clues in the name, universal apps that will run on any of these platforms. I thought Microsoft had kind of got past this Bon OS to rule them all sort of thing. I'm not entirely sure that Windows is suitable for some of those. Would you want Windows running on your oven or your water cooler or anything like that? But anyway, that was the kind of driver behind the Universal Apps platform, the unification of the app experience across these different form factors and devices. From a development perspective, they're run from a single API core layer, so you can just write it and distribute it out to all of those different platforms. There's also a single distribution channel for it as well. You can use the Windows Store, which obviously ships with Windows 10 by default. There's also the Windows Store for Business, which apparently looks something like this. Not that we really need another app deployment interface platform. We have many of them out there, like Citrix Storefront and Web Interface and SCCM portals and things like that. But anyway, that's there as well, should you wish to use it. And the key is it's intended from the application developer perspective to be nice and simple to set up and deploy. And that kind of set me thinking, because I'm not a developer, and I actually did this about a year ago for a user group presentation, but how easy is it to set up a Windows app? So I literally just downloaded Visual Studio and I'd set one up in about 30 seconds. It's completely wizard driven, as you can see. I haven't bothered to put an icon in or anything like that. It was just a quick demonstration to see what could be done. But you can get it there, as I say, within about a minute of firing it up and a bit of hello world goodness, which is obviously the first thing you should do with any application when you get it along. So I don't know what that says from a security perspective, but it is definitely quite easy from a sort of development perspective to be able to actually go in and do that. So, but how much do these universal Windows apps actually differ from, you know, the applications that we're used to dealing with? We used to be dealing with. So, the old way of an application working was simply you had a device and then you took an application and deployed it to that device. You could natively install it, you could layer it, virtualize it, deploy it through any one of a number of different technologies. When the app went down on the device, you would get shortcuts and file system entries and registry entries that were specific to those applications placed on the device. And obviously when a user came along, the user would then use the shortcut to invoke that application, and then various parts of, you know, various config files and whatnot, you know, such as view settings and things like that, would be stored in the user profile to kind of complement the actual application data itself in the device. And this has been the way that we've really dealt with applications very much since the early days of Windows. It's something that we're very, very familiar with, this way of applications behaving. Virtualizing or layering the applications or doing anything clever with them, or, you know, containerizing them, they work around the exact same model. They just have a level of spoofing that goes in there to kind of fool the operating system into thinking that things are in places when really in effect it's not. So under the hood, the application delivery, the application, you know, sort of functionality is exactly the same. It always has been, and this just puts a sort of layer of spoofing on top of it. You do get occasional exceptions like Dropbox and things like that that'll install into the user-specific areas, into the user profile, rather than device-specific areas. But essentially, other than that sort of location being changed slightly, they're very much the same as, you know, the classic way of putting an application down onto the machine. So now I hate this slide because it's quite busy, but what's changed with the Universal Windows Platform model? You know, what things have actually changed under the hood as to how our applications now behave? So what you have is, it's still all centered around the device, but the provisioning of Universal Windows Platform apps only occurs when your user actually comes bouncing along and logs onto the device. So what happens then is there are two main areas where it kind of grabs these apps from to provision them. In the Windows directory, in the System Apps folder, there are the ones that aren't sort of specifically tied to the user. They're things like you know, the lock screen and Cortana and things like that. They're all in the Settings app. They're all sat in there in that System Apps directory. We then have another directory under program files called Windows Apps, which incidentally is actually locked to the system account. It's very hard to get in and mess about with this. Clearly, one was not meant to mess with this by Microsoft. But it looks in these two areas and grabs the list of applications and then basically provisions them down into the user profile itself. So the local app data packages folder is where all of the file system entries are stored for these modern apps when the user logs on for the first time. And the registry entries go into HK current user software, classes, local settings, software, Microsoft Windows current version. Don't know why they've chosen to bury them there. So it's quite slightly different along those lines. You know, it's all provisioned at log on, and all of these apps are basically sort of expanded and deployed as the user logs on for the first time and creates their profile. But what it also has to create as well is the Start menu. Now, the Start menu with regard to Universal Windows apps is comprised from these two areas here. So down here, the local app data packages tells it what UWP apps to put on the Start menu, and it then kind of merges that with the old sort of classic Start menu folder in the program data folder, which contains your legacy apps, and then it merges these together to produce the kind of left-hand side of the Windows 10 Start menu. And just to confuse yourself even further, the actual tiles part, the right-hand side of the Windows Start menu, is controlled by a completely separate bit. In the default user profile, there is an XML file called defaultlayouts.xml, which contains all of the default tiles that are then put onto the user's Windows 10 Start menu on the right-hand side. And this file does get updated by Microsoft, and that's why in earlier versions of Windows you had things like Candy Crush appearing there. In later version you would say, you know, more interesting enterprisey applications like Farmville and World of Tanks and things like that. You can edit this file, but that's the whole thing with the the Universal Windows Platform apps is it's a bit more complicated, a bit more convoluted than sort of the classic way that we had. And a lot of these apps actually, rather interestingly, store all of their settings within that file system in little JetBlue databases, such as you also use to control the start menu itself and the notifications center. So managing and grabbing and dealing with all of these settings is, you know, an order of magnitude harder, really, than it was previously. So that hopefully should clear up possibly some of the sort of queries you might have out there about how specifically the UWP applications are provisioned down onto the machine. So in Citrix environments, there are obviously some particular sort of bits that you will sort of need to be aware of. Now, currently the Universal Windows Platform apps are only on Windows 10 clients. They were in Server 2016 in the technical preview releases, but when the RTM version came along, they were all suddenly removed. Not entirely sure why that was done, but that's the way it is. Server 2016 is almost like an LTSB kind of release now, with all of the modern apps removed. You can publish Universal Windows Platform apps via Citrix XenApp now, or XenDesktop, if you want to. I can't say whether that's going to be a massive kind of use case. Maybe you might want Edge or something like that to run on Windows 7 desktops, you know, but pretty limited use case, I find, at the moment. Now, most of the Universal Windows Platform apps that we have at the moment are kind of sort of single functionally applications or data renderers. For instance, Calculator is, and has been since the very early days of Windows 10, a modern app now, and OneNote often pops itself up as a modern app as well. And these are fairly sort of limited applications. However, there are sort of other ones popping along with regularity. We now have on the right-hand side there, that orange one is the Remote Desktops modern app, which involves a bit more, you know, users will have kind of like connection lists in there. Things like that. There's now a thing called Modern Sticky Notes, which replaces the old favorite sticky notes, so that's now a modern app. But specifically from the sort of migrations and deployments that I've done, the only two applications that I've seen from the UWP apps family that really needed, that really kind of like real use sort of applications, Microsoft Edge, obviously being Microsoft's new super standard compliance browser, and also I've completely forgotten the name of it now. VLC. The VLC video player is another one that's out there on Windows 10 that we have seen people using the UWP version of that. And these are finally apps that have a few settings that you need to grab and maybe persist around in your XenDesktop or VDI environment. So there's slowly getting a little bit of traction behind it, but you know, at the moment, not really that sort of huge a consideration. But how do we go about managing these UWP sort of apps? And if you're in a non-persistent environment, particularly when we try to do this with Microsoft Edge, this is where you get a very big challenge, unfortunately. Now, most of the user settings for Universal Windows Platform apps sit in the local app data folder rather than app data, which obviously, you know, if you're using something like a standard roaming profile, gives you that problem that it's not captured by default, although you can hack your way around it, but it's a bit of a dirty hack. Microsoft say to roam settings using for Universal Windows Platform apps, you should use their Enterprise State Roaming product, which is, I'm not sure if it's still in beta or it's come out of beta, but what I've seen of it, it's very short at the minute. For instance, I mean, obviously you need an Azure Premium AD subscription to do it. You've got the whole cloud-based question to answer as well. But the other thing about it is, I mean, with regards to Edge specifically, that it literally just roams very few settings at all. I mean, things like homepage and favorites and things like that. Last time I looked, which was before the creators update, so I may be outdated on that, it wasn't really doing a lot at all. Some of the profile management tools out there struggle to put their hooks into these Universal Windows Platform apps for persistence, which basically means some of them end up doing sort of file and folder copies, which is not really that sort of far removed from a kind of roaming profile in itself. The solutions I've had most success with around grabbing application settings from things like Microsoft Edge are Citrix Workspace Environment Management, It takes a bit of configuration on the UPM side, but you can get it to work fairly well. Microsoft User Profile Disks for VDI only, and FS Logic's Profile Containers, which is quite a good one for it because it just grabs everything out of the user profile, same as User Profile Disks does, but it actually works works a lot more regularly than User Profile Disks tends to do in my testing. So, however, what you do is, I mean, let's just take a typical setting from a browser, from Edge as a universal Windows platform app. Let's have a look at the sort of search provider. Now, search providers always one of those things that basically I've always, you know, pretty early in a deployment, I've wanted to change it. So everyone's got Google instead of Bing, because Bing's a bit rubbish unless you live in the US. However, Internet Explorer shipped with a bunch of search providers built in, so you just hack some registry keys and set it to Google. Or if you're a tinfoil hat sort of person and worried about the lizard people, you could set it to DuckDuckGo or something like that. So it was nice and easy. Once you knew what the registry key was, you just said. However, Edge uses OpenSearch, which is the same as Chrome does, which is kind of like a very standards compliant, which means that you have to visit the page before you can add another search provider. However, Chrome obviously has Google set as the default, whereas Edge has Bing set as the default. So if you want to change it to Google, somehow you've got to get the user to visit the page first before you can set that particular provider. And once you set the provider, if you look down here, this is not a wind-up. That is the real name of the registry key. It is actually called protected. It is a violation of Windows policy to modify. And it has basically, the search provider is setting this binary key, which is now hashed out. So basically, if you're in a non-persistent environment, that hashed key doesn't match if you've kind of changed device behind that, and what you end up with is basically the user's search provider on another machine gets reset back to Bing, and you get this message. Now, the only way you can get around this is to set it in a custom default user profile, or you can use what's called an OpenSearch XML file, which just came along in the creators update, I believe. So now you can set it like that, and I'm glad I checked, because otherwise I would look like a right idiot. But what you have to do with the OpenSearch XML file, you either have to host it on a web server or you have to have internet access to do it. So the point I'm trying to demonstrate here is just for this one setting that used to be really easy to set in all of the browsers that weren't universal Windows platform apps, in Edge already we've got this kind of level of complication that basically, you know, results in you taking a very long time to actually set something up, and essentially sometimes having to hack your way around it with something that used to be very easy to do. And that kind of paradigm, really, I don't know if that's the right word, that kind of sort of behaviour appears to be quite common to some of the universal Windows platform apps out there. So be prepared for some battles with them if you're trying to persist settings in non-persistent environments. And you may be thinking, can we use policies to control the universal Windows platform apps? There are more GPOs now available, especially with the Creators Update, for universal Windows platform apps, and especially things like Edge. A lot of them, however, are now specifically device-based, which I found really, really strange. And if we look at this one here, this is an example of configuring a corporate homepage for Edge. Some of these GPOs, it actually says there in the description, your employees can change this setting. So the GPO, which is supposed to be a policy, is actually operating more or less as a preference instead, which again I find a little bit odd. Some of the functionality that we would normally expect to get from group policy objects in a lot of these UWP apps appears to have be a bit lacking, or it's been altered in somewhere. And I think, I'm not entirely sure, because I had an interesting conversation on Twitter with some Microsoft bods about this, but I think they're trying to push people more towards in-tune MDM policies to manage the settings for these things, rather than group policy objects themselves. And I was actually just yesterday looking at the whole list of available things in the policy CSP for Intune, and I was quite struck by how much more sort of breadth of sort of choice I had in there compared to the group policy object. So I'm wondering if that is kind of the actual sort of direction coming out of Microsoft now, is to push you towards that Intune model. Obviously, Intune, you can either have the hybrid model where you have it on premises integrated with SCCM, or you can push it all into what they call the standalone one, which is up in the cloud. So it's quite interesting that appears to be almost their preferred way now of managing sort of devices and the settings that go along with the applications in there. However, these are, as I say, at the moment, Universal Windows Platform apps don't have that huge amount of settings that you may need to control this way, as I said, at the moment. However, updating of Universal Windows Platform apps is a bit of a consideration in Citrix environments. Now, modern apps or Universal Windows Platform apps, I've just noticed I left a reference to modern apps in there after I decided to call them Universal apps instead, so I'm now kicking myself under the table. They use a separate update process outside of channels like WSUS or SCCM. They basically go and get their updates themselves. And you will find new applications occasionally popping up on your Windows 10 VDI or even physical desktops. I think it was back in about November of, I can't even remember what year now. That's how old and sort of crazy I'm getting. I think it was about November of 2015, where we came in one morning to a Windows 10 deployment, and we were faced with this icon had appeared on all of our desktops out there, a new lovely green application called Microsoft Sway, which I still haven't really fathomed out what it does. So what happens is, basically, in a channel completely outside of your sort of control, basically these new applications just come and land straight down on your machines, which, if they're good applications, I suppose isn't too bad because you're getting them for free. But if they're things that your users then end up completely and utterly wasting their time on, you possibly wouldn't be that pleased about it. So, bit of a double-edged sword, really. But it gets a bit murkier than that, because in February of the year afterwards, what we've done is, on one of our deployments actually at a university up here in the northeast of England, we'd basically hacked a bit, and we'd created, the lock screen itself is kind of like a Universal Windows Platform app. So we'd done a bit of hacking on it and replaced it with this lovely photo of historic Durham streets with the cathedral there in all its glory. And these sort of things, I think, look really nice. You walk in the library or the open access areas, when the machines are maybe not in use, and they've all got a kind of nice uniform corporate kind of standard out there, and it looks good, it looks professional, people like it, it's very much in keeping with the branding of the institution that was there. Now, what we found in February of 2016, I think, we came in one morning and all of the lock screens had changed to this, which turns out to be an advert for, if I remember rightly, Rise of the Tomb Raider, which was coincidentally available on the Microsoft Windows Store at that time. And this was kind of really, really annoying because it's kind of I've probably made this analogy a few times before. It's like boiling a frog. You know the old analogy that if you put a frog in a pan of boiling water, it will obviously jump straight out. But if you pop it in cold water and heat it up very, very gently, it won't notice that the water's getting hotter and hotter, and eventually it will boil to death. This is kind of what Microsoft seemed to be trying to do with Windows 10, almost as a kind of ad-slinging platform, trying to get away with little bits like this to try and say, how much can we push it? Now, I spoke to Microsoft about this, and they said, oh, you're on Enterprise, that shouldn't have happened, which I found a bit odd, really. But even if I was running the home edition of Windows 10, and if I'd put myself a nice, cool, customized lock screen on there, I would have been quite annoyed to see it sort of arbitrarily replaced by a Universal Windows Platform update. So that's just the sort of little shenanigan that you might find yourself having to deal with. And obviously that you can mitigate that by a GPO. There is a GPO to turn off all store updates. However, it's kind of like a sort of just an on or an off. You couldn't, for instance, say, well, can I have updates for the OneNote app? You can't be that granny with it. It's either all on or all off. So say you had one modern app that you were Universal Windows Platform app you were actually using, for instance, OneNote, and you wanted that to update, you would have to then turn the GPO off again and let all of the apps update with all of the collateral damage that possibly could go on by that, and then have to turn it back on afterwards. Now, not surprising, this can cause obviously issues in PVS environments, because PVS environments by their very nature are meant to be very controlled from an updating sort of process, and if PVS-based servers are going out and fetching all of these updates, which can come down at quite an amazing rate. I mean, there appears to be no schedule at all around them. you know, it's going to cause problems with those PVS servers out there. So really at the minute, and as I say, I'm kind of hoping that Microsoft haven't changed this with the creators update that I haven't finished digging through yet, because it would make me look a bit foolish. But at time of sort of writing, there was no specific way to manage these Universal Windows Platform app updates in an enterprise environment. So now, in non-persistent environments, however, the provisioning behavior for these Universal Windows Platform apps gives us a new problem, and this was our #1 complaint that we had in our Windows 10 deployment. What you get is huge logon times, absolutely enormous logon times compared to what you were used to previously. They are it really stands out. As I said, the #1 complaint, I think 23% of our support calls during one of my initial Windows 10 migrations were complaining about that huge first logon time. And because a lot of these people were working in a VDI environment that was non-persistent, or they were in a hot desking environment such as out in the open access areas, that we couldn't store everybody's profile on the machine, because we would have ended up with tens of thousands of profiles. So every logon had to be a first logon. And what we saw was, with the Universal Windows Platform apps on the left-hand side there, 20 logons that we did using Windows 10 17.03 just the other day, just to ensure that this problem hadn't gone away, were averaged out at 122 seconds. Now, you take all those Universal Windows Platform apps out of your image, and you take it down to 38 seconds for a first logon in a repeat there. So what you get is, that is really one of the biggest bottlenecks of the Universal Windows Platform apps, is this provisioning behavior that you get. You can mitigate against that by switching to solid state drives, which seem to you know, speed it up a bit. But again, you know, people with environments where, you know, they've got existing hardware and they just want stuff to run on it, or they just want to build a new VDI image without ripping out their storage or anything like that, it is a bit of a huge bottleneck, unfortunately. So the big sort of question that really you need to ask yourself when you're talking about Universal Windows Platform apps in a Citrix XenDesktop environment is, how much do you anticipate, either now or in the future, do you want or do you need to run Universal Windows Platform apps in that enterprise environment? Based on my experience, there's kind of 4 possible levels of response that you can get here. The first response at the top there is for people who are very much, you know, very keen to adopt Microsoft's whole new paradigm, and, you know, they think it's all great and there's no problem there, and they're not bothered about any of the performance issues. Then, you know, what you would simply do is let them all sit there in all of their glory and be done with it. Which is not a reaction I say very much, to tell you the truth, but I did a few days work very recently for a client that had left every single one of those Universal Windows Platform apps in their base Windows 10 image, which was very surprising. The kind of second level is people who have, you know, haven't adopted a kind of sort of delivery platform like Storefront or SCCM, anything like that, and they think, oh, the Windows Store for Business, we can use that. It does have some features that kind of, you know, lend itself to that, such as being able to do workflows of requesting apps through there and billing them back to people and things like that. So it is quite nifty. But again, that's not something I've seen a lot of people, particularly in Citrix environments where they're already wedded to Storefront in many cases, to adopt that thing. Now, the most common responses that I say, the last two, and possibly the most common, is the second last one there, that says, right, we want to get rid of those Universal Windows Platform apps, but we want to keep things. The main things I see people keeping are the calculator, obviously, because you don't want to get rid of the calculator for your users, and Microsoft Edge, and occasionally VLC. May increase as more of them come online. So that's the most common response I have. People say, right, we'll get rid of most of them and we'll keep the ones that we actually need. However, there are people who have reacted with the kind of kill it with fire kind of Ellen Ripley flamethrower response to things, and they have said, let's just get rid of them all. And it's quite interesting because you can adopt the LTSB branch of Windows 10, which kind of gets rid of most of them for you anyway. But some people I've seen have actually adopted current branch for business and opted to remove all of the Windows apps from there. So essentially keeping themselves on the quick update model, but getting rid of all the modern apps. If you were to take that approach of purging all trace of them from your systems, what you'd have to remember to do is put the calculator back. And there is a program out there called OldCalc from Winero, which essentially brings back the Windows 7 style calculator, such as you get on the LTSB version as well. You can do all of this removal with PowerShell. I have documented the various levels of this removal up on my blog. Probably needs some updating for the creators update, but hopefully if you wanted to go and have a look at those, you should be able to sort of find your way around those quite easily. So really, from a Universal Windows platform perspective, what are the considerations that we need to look at? So updating we have there is a big one. New apps are pushed down aggressively. It's not integrated with WSUS or SCCM or anything like that. Besides that on or off group policy object, you have very little control over those updates out there, and it can cause problems in sort of provisioning server environments as well. Performance-wise, as we showed you there with the huge difference in the logon times, when it does that provisioning of those UWP apps, the logon is substantially longer in non-persistent environments. I mean, it's really a drag. In the early days, we were seeing people, possibly on older hardware, getting 4, 5, 6 minute logons, which really, compared to the performance they were used to having on Windows 7, was just a major backward step. There's some element of confusion out there as well. There are Universal Windows Platform apps like Contact Support, which are often assumed by users to be a route to the help desk. You've got the Mail app in there as well, which often sits alongside Outlook, and the users are thinking, well, which one should I use? There's a privacy aspect to it as well. Some of these apps have advertising integrated in there. Some of them are paid to collect a lot of telemetry data, which Windows 10 itself does, to be fair. There is some overlap. OneNote, Skype, things like that are available as UWP apps and legacy apps as well, which again feeds into the confusion factor for the users. Management-wise, interesting this, you can't actually create a shortcut to a Universal Windows Platform app, which I find really, really, really weird. So, I mean, you can pin them to the start tiles, you can pin them to the taskbar, but if you want to create a shortcut on the desktop, you can create it, you can point it at the exe, you run the exe, it crashes. So really annoying. If you wanted to pre-configure that, any shortcuts for the users, almost impossible to do. GPO support is a bit lacking as well. User settings wise, it can be difficult, as we showed just with that one particular setting from Edge. I would really recommend that you use a profile management tool. And this leads me on nicely to the second part of this, file type associations. Universal Windows Platform apps are known for aggressively resetting your file type associations, and that, as I say, is something that you may end up seeing an awful lot of and can be really, really annoying. So I think that's quite a nice little feeder into talking about the kind of second part of this session, which is talking about the problems that you may get with file type associations. So what is a file type association? Hopefully everybody knows what a file type association is. It associates a file with an application that's capable of opening that file, or associates a class of files which are usually determined by their file name extension, such as .txt, with a corresponding application such as a text editor. So that's what a file type association is. And a file type association really, from a user perspective, is the way of kind of going into data sets and being able to just invoke applications by working directly with the documents themselves, essentially. So it was quite surprising to find that, you know, we had so many issues with file type associations when we did the Windows 10 migrations. So just a quick rough rundown of how FTAs kind of work. They've always relied on almost a three-step sequence. So we're using the .txt extension as the example here. So you see we've got this three-tiered sort of relationship. .txt is the extension. Now that maps into what's called the file type. Now the file type in this case is txt file. And the file type then maps across to various handlers, and the most common handler application for .txt file is obviously notepad.exe, although you can associate them with many different things. Now, when I was first trying to get my head around this, I thought, why doesn't the extension just map directly to the handler? The reason for that is because the text file can be mapped. Once you map it to text file, you can then map to various different handlers to do various different things. I must apologise for this image quality here because, as I was saying to Andy before we started, I seem to have lost some of the image quality from there. But just right-clicking on an image file there, what you get is various different options that you can do. So you've got preview, set as desktop background, edit, print, rotate, and all of these different options, different commands essentially, necessitate different handlers. For instance, on a .txt file, one of the handlers you get is print, which is basically just notepad.exe with a /p on the end. So it's a separate handler. So that's why I think anyway, that's why the file type exists, to allow you to extend yourself kind of out there and have all of these different commands available from your context menu. So what you've also got, along with the the actual relationship between the extension and the file type and the handler, we have a bunch of registry keys that kind of complement this or map into this. Now, HK classes root is a registry hive that a lot of people often associate directly with FTAs. However, HK classes root only exists for 16-bit application compatibility. It's essentially a merged view of HK local machine software classes and HK current user software classes. As I said, Microsoft only put that in there, and they do say application developers never write to HK classes root, only read from it. So forget about HK classes root, it's just there for backwards compatibility. So again, you then have the registry keys that deal with the mapping of the extension to the file type. Now it'll kind of query these in order. The first one it looks for is HK current user software, Microsoft Windows, current version, Explorer file extensions, .txt or whatever, user choice, prog ID. If the user has defined a particular choice for that, then it will be in there. It'll then look in HK local machine software classes, .txt default, and then HK current user. See in there. It's a bit odd how it queries HK local machine before HK current user. And then once it finds out what the right file type is, the file type mapping to the handler is done by looking in HK local machine software classes txt file, it looks up the handler, or HK current user. Again, it looks up HK local machine first. So those are the registry keys that sit around that, and that's kind of basically sort of how it works under the hood. And there's probably some application developers out there or people who've got more of a knowledge about the inner guts of Windows can tell me the exact sort of behavior behind that. But from our perspective of trying to manage these things, these are the key areas that we have. So how do we go, or did we even go about managing file type associations? Now, in NT4 and 2000 and Windows XP, we had a kind of a bunch of sort of command liney tools that we could use to manipulate the relationship between the extension and the file type and the handler. The main commands you're probably familiar with, assoc.exe and ftype.exe. An example here, using the assoc command, you just type in .txt and map that to the text file. Then you'd use the file type to map text file into the notepad.exe handler. The NT4 resource kit gave you an extra command called associate, which kind of sort of bypassed the middleman and let you associate extensions directly with the handler. Either of these ways were a bit fiddly. I remember having quite a few struggles on Citrix, probably Metaframe XP or 1.8 servers around that time, dealing with these sorts of things. Never really seemed to work quite effectively, but oops, I've gone backwards instead of forwards. How did I manage to do that? I have no idea. Anyway, let's go forwards. But then along came Windows 7 and 2008 R2, and this became almost like a heaven of sort of file type association handling. Because what you could do is you could use group policy preferences folder options. Again, I must apologise about that left-hand image, so I've lost quite a lot of sort of quality there. But anyway, the folder options group policy preference basically let you set up an association, and as you can see on this side, this is showing how you would associate the PNG file type extension with the Microsoft Office Picture Manager, I believe that is. And it was great because it was group policy preferences. You also had the ability to apply this to specific groups of users, so you could set up different ones for different users or on users on different machines. But what you also had was a funky little feature called apply once and do not reapply. So you could set up a bunch of default file type extensions when a user logged on for the first time, and after that they could pick their own, and because this wrote directly into those registry keys that you then roamed around using whatever roaming method, it all worked flawlessly. It was absolutely great. Now at the time, pretty high-end software like AppSense and Res at the time of Windows 7 couldn't do this. GPP, Group Policy Preferences, really had the drop on them, and I thought Microsoft were really in the driving seat here. I thought, great, all this functionality is native, super duper. You know, maybe, I mean, I actually remember at the time taking out an AppSense implementation and replacing it with Group Policy Preferences and Citrix UPM. So Microsoft were quite firmly in the driving seat here from the functionality, and kind of then what happened next? Well, Windows 8 happened and everything went kind of horribly wrong for some reason. Essentially, if you look here, and hopefully this one hasn't lost any quality, this is a shot of that user choice folder for .txt from a Windows 7 registry, and as we say, the prog ID here is set to Notepad++. This user has selected to use Notepad++ to open text files, which is all well and good. However, if you look at the same registry key set up in the same way from a Windows 10 machine or even a Windows 8 machine, because that's where it changed, there is an additional value in here now called hash. This hash value is created from the device, the application, and the user ID. And it's not just that. What you also have on Windows 7, this is the permissions on that registry key, the user choice registry key. As you can see, they are pretty default. Now, if we look at the same permissions on a Windows 8 or Windows 10 machine, you will see that there is at the top of there now an explicit deny for the user on there. And what it is actually denying the user is the ability to set any values within there. So the user can't manipulate those registry keys, which are the reason why the Group Policy Preferences doesn't work anymore, because that's exactly where it wrote to. And what's more, there's this hash value that when it reads the file type associations, it expects the hash value to match whatever it's created from, which I believe is the device, the application, and the user ID. Now, why the change? I put this to Microsoft back in the day, and the response we kind of got was, before Windows 8, apps could set the default handler by manipulating the registry, and you could then use a script or a group policy to do that. However, from Windows 8 onwards, they're verified by a hash that detects tampering by apps, and in the absence of a valid hash, we ignore the defaults in the registry. So essentially what happens in a kind of EDI environment is a user would set, for instance, you know, their text file to open up in Notepad++, which would be their user-defined choice, and then when they went to a new machine and try to run it, they'd be confronted with this file saying, how do you want to open this file, and asking them to define it again. And that's because that hash value doesn't match, and because the deny permission, you can't write to it with a script or anything like that. So it's really annoying, because something that we had solved in Windows 7 we now have big problems with in Windows 10, and we got loads of calls during our migration about things like this. People just saying, you know, I set it up to open with this weird and wonderful app that you use for opening a weird and wonderful file extension, and every time I go to a different desk in the physics department, it doesn't work. And again, like with that big log-on time that we got from the UWP apps, this sort of change made people think, well, the old system was good and this new system that you've given us is rubbish because it just doesn't do things again. So why did Microsoft make this change? And they said it's all about security. That was their sort of watchword: security, security, security. Now, I can understand this to a degree. You don't want malware changing your file type associations so they open up in random bad app. But for these, you know, VDI or even RDSH environments, this is very annoying. It's a bit backwards. But the user can use that GUI method, you know, when it asks you what do you want to open with, to make changes to this. So there's clearly some sort of voodoo going on behind the scenes to actually allow you to edit and change it. So I said, why don't you leverage this functionality, whatever it is, to allow the admins to programmatically set this for the users? That would be great. And then they kind of said, well, admin accounts might get hacked too. And I thought, really? Is that really it? If I'd hacked somebody's admin accounts, would I be going around changing everybody's file type associations? Or would I be emptying your company's bank accounts? And not really convinced by that. But anyway, what they did say was, they said, well, you are aware that there's a group policy object you can use to manage file type associations. And I said, really? Excellent. Let me see it. So I went and dug for it. And basically what you do is you use the dism command to spit out an XML file once you've configured all your file type associations. And then you put that XML file in a file share or local to the machine. And then you set this group policy object called set a default associations config file, which then when the user logs in will overwrite the defined file type associations with the ones that you set up, which sounds good. However, the first problem with it is it basically runs every time the user logs in. So if the user changes something to a different application, this will then change it back, which again is really annoying. But you know, I thought, well, maybe if it's writing to registry keys under the hood, we can use some third-party bit of stuff to get around that. But then I had a look at where this GPU actually lives, and what's wrong with that picture? This is for file type associations. Yeah, file type associations are a user setting, I'm fairly sure. Yet the group policy is a computer config policy. It does not exist in user config, which is kind of means it can only be set on a per device basis. So essentially, you know, at this point I started thinking a really sort of complicated solution. I thought, this is basically just taking us completely backwards. Is there any way we can get this back to the way we used to have it in Windows 7? Well, there is a way you can trick yourself around this. So say to bypass this hash value, essentially you've got a user comes and logs onto the system and the shell starts up. Now as it's loading their profile, what you need to do is make sure when it checks that current version Explorer file extension, we take the example here of setting a PDF file to Adobe Reader rather than a text file. Don't know whether why I changed that over. So it'll check this registry value first. What you need to do is make sure that registry value doesn't exist. So then it will go off and check the HK local machine software classes.pdf default value. You also need to make sure that registry value doesn't exist. Because then it will go and check HK current user software classes.pdf, the default value in there. You need to make sure that this one does exist and that this value has in the file type that you wish to put in. So in this case, that file type I have set to acrox.document.11, which goes to Adobe Reader. So it goes off and reads that file type from the HKLM software classes area of the registry. That file type will then set the open command path to point to Acrobat Reader. It will then, the user will open a PDF file and it will then fire up Acrobat Reader and launch the PDF file in there. So what you've essentially got to do is make sure that those two first values over here don't exist and that that value matches up with the one that you want. So once you've got that kind of in your head, what you can do is enforce a specific FTA by using group policy preferences. So what you do is you set up a delete action. I don't know why I'm pointing at the screen here because obviously none of you can see it. You set up a delete action for that HK local machine software classes entry for PDFs. You set up a delete action for the HK current user defined one. And you set up a replace action for the HK current user software classes one to set the right file type. And then because it's group policy preferences, we can target this to specific groups, which is all really cool. So now we have a way to enforce specific preferences for sets of users. And what you can do is set that to apply once and not reapply, which means you can enforce that default setting when the users log in for the first time. So that's all quite cool, how that works like that when it comes to enforcing a specific FTA. However, if you wanted to roam it around, you would have to get a little bit cleverer, unfortunately. Do a bit of scripting. So you need to first of all make sure, as you can see from this image, that you have the apply once and do not reapply set, so it only applies those default settings when the user first logs in. And then you need to run a bit of PowerShell as a log off script, which basically checks that user choice value to see if the user has defined anything within there, if they've actually changed it, and if it does, copy that to the default value. And then when the user logs back in the next time and it deletes the user defined value and deletes the HKLM value, it will then read that one that you've copied across, and you now have roaming of your FTA settings, which all sounds fabulous, and that does actually seem to work reasonably well. However, if you start getting into things like browser file type associations, you find yourself in a completely different kettle of fish. You have different entries for protocols, you have lots of different file types, lots of different registry areas. So again, rather more difficult to enforce these, but I'm quite, sort of confident that it could be, I won't say easily, could be done by using, a bit of scripting or tooling out there. So, however, and this brings us straight back to our good friends Universal Windows platforms. If you start tinkering with the registry in this way, the UWP apps will just overwrite it all if you allow them to, and you'll see that horrible app default was reset popping up all over the place. So if you want to be able to deal with FTAs and you haven't got like a profile management tool that can capture it, and you have to use that method I've just described, you really can't have too many of these Universal Windows platform apps kicking about. Particularly Edge, unfortunately, which is notoriously aggressive at grabbing back the PDF file type association, which is the one that I kind of see it the most. So it kind of gives us a bit of a problem when it comes to summing this up, because it's almost as if, the Universal Windows platform apps kind of really cause more issues than potentially the benefits that you're actually getting out of them. So in my experience of dealing with UWP apps and FTAs in XenDesktop or even XenApp environments, these are the key things that I like to recommend. Number one, get as many as those Universal Windows platform apps as possible out of your image. I know it's probably making kind of people, Microsoft sort of centric people a bit annoyed, but you have to get as many of them out as you can. What do you need to leave behind? What is it your users expect to use? Calculator, as I say, you could remove it and replace it with old calc, which gives you the old sort of calculator, or you could set a PowerShell script just to ignore anything with calculator in it. Edge, again, Edge is really, really aggressive about resetting. Do you want to use Edge as the browser in your environment, or are you happy with Internet Explorer or even Chrome? You really need to have a think about which one of these apps you may need, and you need to leave in there. However, if you remove them using PowerShell, if somebody then comes along and says, I wanted that app, I want it back, you can reinstate them easily without, sort of re-imaging the entire machine. So I've used the PowerShell methods, which are also documented across on my blog. You can easily reinstate them. Now, there are some unremovable UWP apps. I mean, obviously, don't remove stuff like Cortana or the lock screen or the settings app, or you will give yourself some horrendous problems. But things like contact support, and I can't remember, there's a few other ones. There's some Xboxy sort of ones sat in the WinDIR system apps folder. Go in there and just rename the folders, and it will stop those apps from provisioning down on the machine. So that's quite a funky trick to use. Again, because you're renaming them and not deleting them, you can reinstate them if anybody twists about them. Always disable a Universal Windows Platform app updates in the Windows Store via GPO, or it will start pounding them back down on you. It did used to, when you did a Windows 10 feature update, put back all the Universal Windows Platform apps that you removed, but since the Creators Updates come along, Microsoft have said they will now honour any removal, so it shouldn't put them back down, although it may chuck a few new ones in. So again, be careful. Using a profile management solution is really recommended. Workspace environment management, profile containers, things like that. Again, a whole host of questions to be asked about that, but really using roaming profiles or anything like that doesn't seem to quite cut the mustard with regard to UWP or FTAs. If you can get a profile management tool that helps you capture the FTAs, I know Profile Containers does it, you can get Workspace Environment Management stroke UPM to do it as well. Otherwise, you'll have to use that hacky method that I showed in the presentation. Always use a custom default user profile and custom start layout, because if you don't, what will happen is that you will end up with, it'll try and put a bunch of modern Universal Windows Platform app shortcuts on your start menu, and if you've removed them, they're not there, and it'll look horrible and blank and awful. And if you do need to adopt the Universal Windows Platform apps, you need to kind of manage them separately from your legacy applications because they don't obey any of the accepted norms around there. So those are the sort of key things that I would normally recommend. So the biggest sort of choice really is to get in there and find out how many of these things you can remove and how you can then avoid giving yourself that terrible problem with the resetting of the file type associations. And once you've got rid of that, you can then actually look into finding a reliable way to roaming around your file type associations if you're in a non-persistent environment. So I think that's just about on time from that. So yeah, if there's any questions out there that Andy has got to fire at me,
there are indeed a couple of questions, if you don't mind, James. And thanks very much for that. I found it informative. Again, really appreciate the time that you've taken in order to put that all together. I think the first question that came through said that you'd mentioned WEM, you'd mentioned UPD, you'd mentioned FSLogix, but have you, with the handle of AppSense Bigot, done any testing with Avanti AppSense Desktop Now personalization? I think
yes.
That would be yes. And,
yes.
And I think you cover that at the end as well, in that use these tools to help.
Yeah, the main problem I found with some of the higher end tools, and I haven't spoken to anybody from Avanti or AppSense recently or Res, is that they struggle to hook those UWP apps for personalization. That was the issue. Now, getting the file type associations and things like that can be done in there. But what you were reduced to with personalizing Edge and things like that, you were reduced to kind of file and folder copies, which, I mean, it does manage quite admirably, but it would be better if they could capture that into kind of their native personalization. Having said that, they may have solved that now. I haven't checked with them recently, so apologies if there's anyone from AppSense or Avanti out there and they're going, the idiot, has he not noticed that we can do that now? But that was the issue I found with it early on. The reason I kind of erred down the kind of UPD or profile containers route is because it just grabs the whole user profile and I don't have to worry about managing any of it. But obviously you then have storage overheads and you know it's not portable between operating system versions. So, but again, it also grabs the file type associations quite effectively as well.
Cool. Hopefully that's answered Dan's question and maybe even touched on Jeff's question, which was saying, why did you not mention AppSense a bit more, which you have done just now. Jason asked, he missed the beginning, and obviously you've touched on removing applications. His specific question was around the mail application when you're pairing it with Outlook. That's possible, yes. I mean, you didn't give specifics on removing individual apps, but you can, if you need to, just remove specific UWP. It's not all or nothing. It's not, you can have them all. You can,
the PowerShell scripts basically that you use to this, you can either say, you can either give it a string to work on, say just remove apps with this string in them, or remove all apps except anything that matches this string. So yeah, you can mix them. I mean, you can remove them one by one. The problem is, the reason I find it easier to say just name the ones I want to keep and then take everything else is because you're never really sure what set of apps is actually going to be on a Windows 10 machine. That's the problem I'm finding. I mean, it's a kind of it changes all the time. But yeah, you can remove them individually. Yeah.
Indeed, and to that point, which was one of your slides, because a couple of people have said, oh, they've missed it. Is it going to be recorded? Yes, it's going to be recorded. But one of the points that you brought up was having all of the Windows apps in can increase the logon time significantly, and if you've got, say, PBS environments, cause all sorts of complications. So ideally, it's a whitelist of applications. Like these are the ones that we're going to keep, and everything else goes away.
Yep.
Cool. And then, how do you identify all UWP apps? So in a list of applications, how do you tag them?
You go digging. Really, that's the thing. You can see on the start menu, because the only way a Universal Windows Platform app can actually have a shortcut is it is on the start menu. So you can look up and down the start menu. But if you really want to get down and dirty, what you can do is that Program Files Windows Apps folder. I did a blog post about this. You can actually use PaceExec to run a command prompt in the system context, and then you can go in and actually look in that folder, and you will be amazed at the amount of weird and wonderful stuff stuff in there, like Twitter apps and Facebook apps and Candy Crush and all sorts of things in there. So it's a combination of the two, looking on the start menu and going digging. The one thing you've got to be careful is if you go digging is you don't want to disable something that's vital to the operating system, like the lock screen or Cortana or something like that, or the settings app. So you have to be a little bit careful.
And just because it's fun and exciting, Brian, and it's fun and exciting, Brian, because James, before we even started, went, I hope we don't get too many questions about the Creators Edition because I haven't had a chance to have a look at it yet in depth, as I know that James likes to do. But Brian's asking, do you see big changes, behaviour differences regarding UWP, FTA with the new Creators Edition update? And I think I've answered that question for you already.
Yeah, I think the main thing I was sort of conscious is that I've been speaking to somebody from the roaming profiles kind of area of Microsoft. I was amazed they actually had, to be perfectly honest, and they're saying that they were looking at getting various parts of it sort of sorted out. So I was wondering whether they'd managed to fix the FTAs in roaming profiles. They probably will do that, I think, by basically disabling that hash value for a profile that is then listed as roaming. That's kind of the same way they dealt with the cookies issue that they had a few years ago. But I haven't seen too much of the creators update. I can't really say that much difference, even just browsing around it. Apart from one really annoying thing, they've removed the control panel from the right-click start menu, which has annoyed the hell out of me. And I think they're slowly phasing us away from using the control panel back down towards this new settings app.
Righty-ho. Good. Hopefully, Brian, that answered that question. I've nothing more. Any final thoughts, James?
I think that the main thing that I'm kind of sort of thinking about is, is Intune, as I mentioned briefly in there, and Microsoft seem to be almost angling Intune as the kind of the replacement for group policy. I did speak to a Microsoft guy who said, no, group policy is not going away, but I think the concept of the domain almost is becoming kind of outdated, really, and that's something that really we need to consider, that we're going to be managing our devices amongst cloud services rather than an old-fashioned Active Directory domain. That's my thought for the day.
Ooh, chuck us a link to your blog. All right, okay. Ben's asking for a link to your blog, which I think you put in the chat window.
Yep, I put one in there.
Excellent. So there's a link to James's blog in the chat window. Stephanie's just put a link to a survey. Please fill out the survey, short and anonymous. Obviously, and we do this at the Citrix user groups. At the end of the session, it helps us to help you, some feedback and understanding of what's going on. That would be excellent. Stephanie, I've had a whale of a time. It's been a well-attended event. You have recorded it, and we'll put that up soon, I'm sure.
Yep, and everyone will receive a link and an email following this webinar, and it'll also have another link to the survey in case nobody has a chance to fill it out now. And I also put a link in the chat to the discussion thread on the CUGC forums, so that if you do have more questions or want to talk about this topic some more, you can have those discussions there. We'll make sure that James sees any questions or comments.
Cool.
And you can also on mycugc.org, you can find us at Synergy. We have a whole page dedicated to where we'll be, and we hope to see a lot of you there.
And also investigate your own local events. MyCUGC is throughout the US and Europe and beyond. Hook up via the site, find out where you've got a local meetup, and get yourself along and interact interactively.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you so much. Thanks, James. I'm so glad to have you back, and clearly everyone else was happy to have you back as well. And thank you, Andrew, for moderating and keeping an eye on those questions.
No problem. It was fun as ever.
All right, well, I hope we have a part 3.
Yes, I think that could well be in the offing. Talk about performance stuff on there, but yes, definitely.
Excellent.
Just put you on the spot a little bit.
Yeah, ask him while he's hot.
All right, if there's nothing else, then I'll close out the webinar. And if you asked more questions after we were wrapping it up, I'll make sure James gets those, and we will get those posted, and the answers to that posted in the forum for you. And the link to the forum post will also be in the email that goes out.
Cool. Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay. Cheers, guys.
Speak to you again. Cheers now.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.